I'm going to talk nice and slowly. So for the purpose of these webinars that we are doing as Joy Magazine in collaboration with 4SA, this is a 4-week series. You are listening to webinar number 2. And if you would like to see last week's session, you can either pop us an email or alternatively, you can go onto the 4SA YouTube channel where you will find it. And we encourage you to actually pre-register onto this webinar session so that you can get reminders every week, because it's from 7 to 8 p.m. We will, of course, do our best to respect your time. We might go a little bit over, but I'm sure you will all acknowledge that it is certainly a weighty matter and worth discussing in detail. So just to start, before we get into the questions for tonight, at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat function where you are welcome to put any questions you might have into the chat function. We will, of course, do our utmost to answer those questions within the course of tonight. But if for any reason we run out of time and we can't answer them, we will do our best to engage with you offline via email or perhaps in next week's session. So thank you for being patient with us. We know that these topics are of utmost importance in the world that we find ourselves today. And as Christians, we are so passionate about seeing our world bettered for good and seeing the biblical principles that we hold fast to, being able to improve people's lives and improve the world that we live in, which is a very dark and troubled place. And we come to bring hope and to bring life and to really just improve our communities and our lives around us. And one of the ways that we know this is so important is through our advocacy that we do on numerous issues. And that is why an organization like 4SA deserves commendation and recognition tonight, because they really do serve on the front lines and are doing such a good job at defending faith, family, and freedom in the public and the legal sphere. So tonight, that is the topic that we are going to be addressing, and how the global liberal agenda is undermining these values and what we can do as Christians to resist or to hold back the tide of darkness and evil that we see engulfing us. And so without delay, I'd like to hand over to our 2 legal eagles tonight. We have Advocate Nadene Badenhorst, familiar to many of you at home. She obviously is part of the 4SA directory team. And then we've got Daniela Ellerbeck. Daniela, I hope I pronounced that right. I'm so sorry. And Daniela Ellerbeck, and she is an attorney, and she is also part of the legal team for 4SA. So ladies, welcome. I'm going to jump straight in, and then you will have plenty of opportunity to give us your valuable insights. I see we all got the dress code as well, so we are rightly royal red tonight. So let's just start. For some of the folks at home who may not be familiar with 4SA, tell us a little bit about who you guys are, and more specifically, like, what is freedom of religion and belief? Because that doesn't just apply to Christians, it applies to any person's belief and religion.
Yeah. So Jackie, let me jump right in, and thank you so much again for the opportunity tonight. So 4SA stands for Freedom of Religion South Africa, and we are not a law firm, but we are a legal advocacy organization, or a human rights organization, and we specifically work, as our name says, to protect and promote the fundamental or the constitutional right to religious freedom. Now, immediately as you asked, what is religious freedom? Now, religious freedom is a right, a fundamental right, a human right that every person has, simply because they're human beings. So of whatever faith, whatever religion, you have the right to freedom of religion, and it's specifically written into our constitution in section 15. And importantly, our Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the country, has in various cases already given interpretation to the right to religious freedom, content to it. And it said what this right entails is the right to not only believe in our hearts, whatever we want to believe or not believe, but also the right to freely share with others what we believe, whether it's in person, sharing it with a colleague, a neighbor, also the right to share from the pulpit our beliefs, also on social media, so really in any space. And then also the right to freely live out our beliefs, again, not just in the privacy of our own home or in the context of a church or a synagogue or a temple, but out there in the marketplace. And it's really with regard to those two components that there is this threat to religious freedom, because increasingly the message is believe in your heart, whatever you want to believe, but be very careful what you say and be very careful how you live out your beliefs. Jackie, just importantly, a point that I want to make is, even though we work in the space of faith and religion, we ourselves are not a religious organization, like for instance the SACC or another denomination or church would be. We don't, as an organization, hold to a particular doctrinal position. So our rallying point is, and the people who are on this call will understand it, as Christians, we often disagree with one another around certain texts in the Bible, infant baptism, adult baptism, healing now, healing ultimately. But our rallying point is this, that we should be free to believe what we want to believe and interpret the scriptures for ourselves, but we can agree on this, that it's not for the state to tell us what we should or shouldn't believe. And so contrary also to what's been said or published, we don't work for a Christian nation. We don't work for Christendom. No, our job is simply to protect freedom of religion for all faiths in South Africa.
Absolutely. I think that is very, very much an important point, because some people confuse a Christian wanting to stand up for freedom of religion as them exerting their way, but it's really that it gives everybody the platform and opportunity, because we all are inhibited and at a disadvantage if government oversteps its boundaries in that regard.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think that is so important. So, Daniela, tell us, what does 4SA do on a practical level?
So, Jackie, we get involved in different spheres. So we get involved in front of government with the government departments when they are looking at potential policies and bills, and we lobby with them, we meet with them. Recently, listeners and viewers might know that we met with the Minister of Justice on the Computer Amendment Bill. And then we also get involved in front of Parliament when Parliament is looking at making laws and so forth. So again, recently we had a big campaign about the hate speech bill that Parliament is currently sitting with. And we will also be meeting with the different members of Parliament, the MPs, after the local government elections when they start looking at this bill. So government of Parliament, and then also various government institutions like the Chapter 9. So, for example, that's your Commission for Gender Equality, your CRL Rights Commission, and so forth. We get involved there, your South African Human Rights Commission. So we get involved there when they are having investigations and so forth. And then also court cases. For example, we've been a friend of the court in many cases. We've also taken cases to the Constitutional Court. Jackie, basically anywhere where religious freedom, which, like Nadene said, is your right to live out your faith and to talk about your faith, is threatened. That is where we get involved.
Well, I certainly know from behind the scenes, working with you over the years with Joy, just how valuable the service is that you do, and just how necessary it is. And one of the things that we've noticed at the magazine, which obviously you guys experience all the time, is how over the last decade, the onslaught against Christian values, against family values, not even Christian, just family values, and parental influence in children's lives, just religious presence in society has really been eroded, and it seems to be escalating. Just a simple thing like the parental guidance controls and age restrictions on movies. I watched a 2 to 13 movie the other day with my child who's in high school, and I was shocked at the age restriction. It was so low, but yet for me, I don't think that movie was appropriate even for an adult. And it wasn't necessarily the content, but it was just the nature of what was, the violence and all of that. And so I think that society has often become desensitized and progressively more liberal. But why do you guys think that it seems that society is so at war and at odds with our Christian faith today?
Yeah, Jackie, that's actually a question that I often get asked, and seeing that I would imagine that most of the people on the call in this meeting tonight are Christian people. So I'm a Christian myself, and even though 4SA is faith neutral, I think it is important to bring a Christian perspective to it as well. And I was just thinking earlier of that scripture. I think it's in I wrote it down actually in 2 Timothy 3 verse 1-5, where it says, "But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves." And then it carries on, "without self-control, not lovers of the good, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God." And then it carries on like that. So I think what's important is this thing of people who are lovers of themselves rather than lovers of God, who call evil good, and, who, so there's this love of pleasure, and basically a love of everything that's, where God places boundaries on a certain way of living. And I think it's got to do, that is the liberal agenda, is where self is autonomous. There's no longer acknowledgement of a king, a lord, to whom we will ultimately give an account, but I am king of myself. So I will decide for myself what is the best way to live. I'm king of my own body, my own identity, and a complete almost disregard for God's blueprint, God's design for life, which says if you obey his commands and live life according to what he sets out in the word, then you will be blessed, a following of his ways rather than our own. And then I was also thinking, of just that scripture in John 13 verse 16, where it says, "The servant isn't greater than the master. If they persecuted Jesus, they will persecute us." So we shouldn't be surprised. Things are not, things aren't really going to get easier for Christians, because it's actually forewarned. It's prophesied in the Bible. And so I think that's really on a spiritual level, and Daniela can speak more at a legal level. But I think spiritually, this is exactly what the Bible told us about, what we will see happening in the last days, where people will regard themselves as king, and they will decide for themselves what is good in their eyes, rather than submitting to God's ways and God's blueprints.
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to, that whole issue of people want moral autonomy. They want to be able to choose for themselves right and wrong, but we don't live within a bubble. So if there is a person who thinks that pedophilia is morally acceptable to him, well, it doesn't just remain in his sphere, but it actually then could influence your children. It could influence your nephews, your grandchildren. So that's why it's so important that as Christians, we have to defend faith, family, and our freedoms, because it's not just for ourselves, and it's not just about Christianity, but it's about right and wrong. And the world doesn't want moral absolutes, but we know that is what makes the world a safe place.
And what we're fighting for, Jackie, importantly, is not just for our generation. Once rights are lost, they aren't easily regained. So that's why it's so important to, in our generation, to, at this point in time, stand up and take a stand for our rights, because once they're lost, they really aren't easily regained.
And I think that is what I want to touch on now is, I remember several years ago when we would publish Christian news and talk about why it's so important that Christians actually engage with the law and engage with getting involved in the public process. And the thinking back then was, oh, well, if something's in the law, it doesn't really affect me and my circle and my family. But we have seen, certainly the last 2 years, how the law affects every area of your life. So,
absolutely.
Daniela, how does the law further an agenda? Whatever that agenda may be, we're not going to go into detail of the different agendas tonight, but we all know sitting here that there are several that are anti-family, anti-Christian, anti-freedom. So how does the law actually get abused in that sense to further it?
Sure, Jackie. So the law both depicts a society's values, but it's also able to shape them. So the law can be used as an instrument for social engineering, which is what we've seen. Now, our Constitution, which is our country's highest law, depicts the ideal type of South African society, the society that we as South Africans are to strive for. And our Court, the highest court, has said various times that it makes decisions based on this ideal society, not necessarily the wishes and or beliefs of the majority. And that is why we sometimes see such a disconnect between the law and the values and beliefs of the majority. So an example would be the death penalty. I don't know if this is still the case, but a few years ago, you know, if you ask the majority of South Africans where their stance was on the death penalty, most South Africans were pro-death penalty. But yet years ago, the Constitutional Court said that actually, no, the death penalty goes against our highest law, the Constitution in our country.
Yeah, so in that regard, you know, obviously South Africa has always prized its constitution, and I think that to the uninformed, certainly myself, before people like the EFF pitched up on the scene, we always felt that the constitution was untouchable, that it cannot be changed, that it cannot be modified. But we have seen that obviously with enough votes, or whatever the legal terminology is, one can actually make amendments to it. So Daniela, you touched on the social engineering. I mean, we've seen it globally, there's a shift. How does South Africa compare on the global scale? I would assume it's happening in specifically places like Europe and America as well. Or Nadene, let me ask you, sorry.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
I'm going to ask Nadene to take that.
All right. So, Jackie, I think firstly, it's important to recognize that South Africa's constitution is hailed, is applauded almost internationally as, you know, a very progressive constitution, as an example constitution to many countries, but actually also it's regarded as a social experiment, our constitution in many ways. And what is important also is that the original role of the constitution, and particularly the Bill of Rights, which enshrines all these different rights, human dignity, equality, freedom of speech, but also freedom of religion, the original role and function of it was to actually curb the power of the state, so that the state couldn't abuse its powers vis-a-vis individuals. But now in South Africa, what we are seeing is that increasingly that is no longer the only role that the Bill of Rights fulfills. Increasingly, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, in particular, the rights enshrined therein, the equality rights and all these other rights, are being used in the hands, in particular, of activists to do exactly what Daniela said just now, to bring about a form of social engineering. And what we mean by that is to basically shape the values and the character of our country in a certain way. You know, what they would regard as liberal, what they would be regarded as acceptable for a modern and a politically correct society. And so increasingly we're seeing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights being stretched actually beyond its original role. And that is happening certainly in South Africa, but it's also something that we're seeing playing out on a worldwide scale. And so what they're doing is the social engineering, the using of the law to produce certain desired characteristics in its population. For instance, with regards to matters how we should think, what we should be allowed to say. And that's, of course, where the hate speech bill comes in, how we should be allowed to conduct ourselves, even in our businesses, even in the church, you know, even just in our private homes. And that is, again, where a bill like Panda becomes important. It is very ironic, though, that this very same constitution that people now, in particular the activists, use to do this, to, in a sense, enforce conformity on us as a people, is the very same constitution that recognizes in its preamble that we are a people united not in our conformity, but in our diversity, recognizing that we come from such different backgrounds, religions, cultures, and yet we see this imposition of almost a certain kind of uniformity. This is how South Africans should think. This is how they should speak. This is how they should act. And this is being done through laws, and it's also being done through court cases that are often driven, as I say, by activists driving a secular, humanist, liberal agenda.
Absolutely. I think you completely articulated what I have been thinking and what I've said for many years as well, which is that often when you see a majority movement or a majority ruling, it doesn't actually reflect the feelings of the majority. It's a case of he who shouts the loudest gets the floor. Yeah. And certainly there are organizations both locally and globally, we just have to mention the name George Soros here, that have billions behind them in order to forward their agendas. So it makes one seem through media and the legal systems coming together and the education systems coming together, it makes one seem that this is what the majority wants, but it's actually not the case.
No.
Now, I want to ask you, Daniela, so there's a famous sort of healthy skepticism, I think, that has certainly come in with COVID and if I just think about the CSE program in the schools called Follow the Money. And in this context, I have read and heard that the United Nations has a lot of influence in South Africa, unbeknown to most people, because of through various funding, whether it's at a school level, at a societal level. How is it that a country like South Africa, which generally still regards itself as quite conservative, is accepting this UN agenda and almost being forced into complying with their various stipulations that they put forward?
So, Jackie, just to answer in general there, because that could be a very complicated question. But in general, short answer would be follow the money. So if one looks at it, financial aid comes at a price, namely the adopting of certain, legal positions through policies and laws. And to touch on what you mentioned there, CSE, for example, our Minister of the Department of Basic Education answered a member in Parliament in writing when this member asked her, okay, who's paying for this program? And she's told this parliamentary member in writing that USAID awarded a contract of over $25 million US. So that's roughly, approximately probably like half a billion rand to the Education Development Center to implement CSE over a 5-year period. So that is a lot of money. And I do have to say that what exactly the relationship between the Education Development Center and the Department of Basic Education was unclear to me at this time when I read the answer. But that is a lot of money to push a certain set of values, a certain view of, what our children should be taught about sexuality and sexual ethics.
Mm-hmm. Now, to that point,
so Jackie, maybe I can just elaborate there. So what we're seeing increasingly happening in South Africa, as in many African countries, is because we are developing countries. The developed world offers huge, and CSE is an example, offers huge sums of money to developing countries, but it often comes with a price tag. And the price tag is, we'll give you the money, but then you need to implement these liberal laws. And CSE, comprehensive sexuality education, is but one example of that. So people often say, but these things are against many African values or traditions. Yeah. How is it that in Africa these things are being enforced upon us? But it's because of this price tag, that whether it comes from the United Nations itself, or UNESCO, or various, or UNAID, these different agencies of the United Nations, or just from some of the developed world countries. And it comes with this promise of aid, which obviously the developing world is desperate for, but then it comes with this price tag. And often they're in a situation where they're so desperate for the money that they simply have to say yes. And that is how a lot of these laws that many would argue are actually foreign to us, how they get to be part of actually our countries and our legal systems.
So there's so much more that I could add and ask to that point. I'm watching the clock though, but I can just see, ladies, I mean, there is just so much more we need to talk about on that point. Because I'm sure what a lot of the folks at home are feeling, and maybe we'll get some time to address this later, but I do have some other questions first, is how do you then resist? I mean, if it's out of your control and governments make decisions, what role do you as the little person on the ground make? So we'll get back to that later. But I just want to ask you, Nadene, on a sort of grassroots level, what kind of agendas, we've heard about the CSE, which obviously that sexual education program in schools is really had a lot of publicity over the last year or so, but what are some practical examples and how they've affected our freedom of religion?
Yeah, so Jackie, I'm just going to speak broadly first, and then maybe we can zero in and Daniela can mention some specific examples. But on a macro level, what we're seeing, and this ties in with what I said right in the beginning. So freedom of religion is the right to believe in your heart, whatever you want to believe or not believe, but also the right to freely say what you believe and the right to freely live out your beliefs. And as I said, it's really with the last two components that there is a problem, because increasingly the message that is being thrown not only at Christians, but generally people who hold to conservative values and conservative beliefs, which could also include some of the Muslim beliefs and just people generally who hold to conservative moral views. The message is believe in your heart what you want to believe, but we don't want to hear it, and we definitely don't want to see it, because it's being regarded as fundamentalist, bigoted, politically incorrect, homophobic, all these labels that are being put on it. And so it's both speech and action that are being curtailed both by government policy and the laws that are coming before Parliament. And increasingly we are finding that people of faith, and Christians in particular, so pastors, churches, Christian ministries, schools, independent Christian schools, even in public schools, there was the OGOD case, businesses, school teachers, university professors, professional people, people who run their businesses, with Christian values. Basically, if you're Christian today, then there is a target on your back. No one is exempt. And these are all different examples of court cases that we have been involved with, whether before the Human Rights Commission, Commission for Gender Equality, or all the way up to the Constitutional Court, and where people have been taken to court simply for sharing their faith or for living it out. And so this is happening in South Africa, but we see the very same trend happening worldwide in other democracies.
Yeah, I must say to some extent, it feels like we're a little bit, in a good way, behind the rest of the world, where we can at least a nurse can still pray for someone if they say they want prayer, whereas in England, it's really ridiculous. But then on the other hand, it feels like, as you said, South Africa is a social experiment, and there's a lot of progressive work being done, particularly when it comes to the Marriage Act, the CSE, etc. So Daniela, I want to ask you about that, because we actually got a question in the chat section, which is similar to the point I'm going to ask you. And, it's one thing to say as a Christian, okay, you can have your own beliefs, but we don't want to hear about it. Okay, fine. But now what I see happening is civil society and government is forcing Christians to act against their beliefs. And that's a very different actual sort of bend that we see, and a very dangerous trend that we see. So for example, forcing a venue to host a marriage, a gay marriage perhaps, or some kind of ceremony that they don't agree with, forcing a pastor to marry a couple that they don't want to. So tell us a little bit more about that whole controversy around that Marriage Act or policy. I'm not sure what the right word is there.
So I mean, what you mentioned there is an example of a policy that would curtail religious freedom and belief, because like Nadene said, your religious freedom also gets curtailed when you're forced to act against your beliefs. And I mean, we've already mentioned, like you said, CSE was one policy, and you're asking specifically about the Department of Home Affairs' marriage policy at the moment. So this policy is still in its very early form, and they released a draft of it and asked for public comment. Now, what's important is that with this policy, religious marriage officers, so your pastor who has a marriage license, your domini who has a marriage license,
or your imam, or Hindu priest, so it's not only confined to the Christian faith.
Basically, your religious leaders who have and who are employed by a religious organization like a church or a temple and so forth, who then also have a marriage license so they can register marriages with the Department of Home Affairs. One of the proposals put forward in this draft policy was to force all marriage officers or religious marriage officers to conclude any type of marriage or marriages, irrespective of whether it goes against their religion and belief. So, I mean, practically put, this would force a Roman Catholic priest to marry someone who has been excommunicated from that church for, being divorced. It would force a Muslim imam to marry, a Hindu couple who want to get married according to Hindu rites. So it is a policy that is not yet, in effect, it's still in draft form. But it is very concerning that something like that, forcing people who aren't employed by the state, who work for religious organizations, private religious organizations, to do something like solemnize marriages that go against the religious doctrines and faith of that religious institution that they're part of.
So to that point, can you just educate us, please? Because I have to watch my P's and Q's around the lawyers. How does something start in South Africa? Does it become a draft and then it's a policy and then it's a law or a regulation, or what is the process and what is the timeline of these things? Because sometimes it feels like the hate speech bill felt like it was being talked about for a long time, and then all of a sudden Christians woke up, and I think just in the 11th hour we got in there, which we shouldn't have left it that late.
11th hour, minute 59.
Exactly. But then the other side of the coin is sometimes it feels like before you know it, suddenly something's being passed. None of us knew about it. Overnight they changed it. So how does the process normally work?
So Jackie, first of all, we will be publishing an article in Joy that talks about this.
Good.
So I would advise listeners to go and grab a copy, maybe in a month or two when that article is in Joy. But to briefly answer your question, generally, I mean, there are other routes for laws to start, but generally you'll have a department sit with a law. So for example, if we take the hate speech bill as an example, that bill was drafted by the Department of Justice, and the department then asked the public for comment, because thank goodness we live in a democracy, which means that the government can't just do what they want to do when it comes to law. They need to ask us because they represent us, and it's governed by the people for the people. So they need to ask for our input whenever they make a law. So the Department of Justice then asked people and said, listen, guys, this is our first draft of this hate speech bill law that we're thinking of. These are the aims of the bill. This is what we're proposing. It says, what do you think? And Nadene was involved in that first push against the hate speech bill and meetings with the Department of Justice. That was back in 2016.
I can't remember, many years back.
It was quite a few years back, but I think they got over 60,000 submissions back then. So then the Department of Justice looked at those submissions. They met with 4SA, and they changed the bill to include a religious exemption clause. Then they gave that bill to Parliament, because Parliament is our legislative authority. It's our lawmaking body in the country. Parliament took that bill and said, okay, we're asking for the public to make comments on this thing. This is now what we're considering, this new second draft version of it. And that's what recently passed. So once that bill has gone through both houses of Parliament, likely with another round of public comments in the second house, it will go to the president, who will then sign it into law. So a couple of years, different timelines for different bills, depending on government's priorities and how fast things move.
Yeah.
But at least 3 chances generally to give public comments.
So much of it is a political question, Jackie, on how high is it on government's political agenda and how much push is there often by activists, driving their agendas to get this bill through. So what happened with the hate speech bill in particular, that was dependent on a court case to come out, and that's why that one took such a long time. But for instance, one like Panda or some of the other bills, went through kind of the processes quite quickly, because there was a lot of political pressure that was being exerted for that. So yeah, a lot of variables.
Okay, well, I'm looking forward to reading your article in our magazine, because there's lots more that I want to know about those bills as far as what level of engagement is required. Yeah. But again, we will certainly make sure that everyone who has registered for these webinars gets a copy of that article as well, because I think that what everyone has realized, or I certainly hope is starting to realize, is, and I'm speaking specifically in the realm of Christianity and the church, is that we have to do something. We cannot be apathetic. We all know the quote that says, evil prospers when good men do nothing. If we sit back and go, oh, it's someone else's problem to sort it out, someone else can write the survey or the petition, well, someone else becomes no one else. And then suddenly when a law is passed, we all sit back and go, what happened? So yeah, I certainly think that article is critical.
I think in the final session, also the 4th webinar, Jackie, I think we're going to be speaking a lot about that, in terms of, well, how can we then make our voice heard? What can we actually do? So that will be a very important one, not to miss.
Absolutely. And as I said, we've got everyone's details if you have registered. So we will certainly let you know when that will be published. Obviously in Joy magazine, which is South Africa's leading Christian magazine. available in shelves, and you can subscribe. And I add that because I saw a question of one of the pastors asking where they can get it. I'm going to come back to some of my questions, but just on that note, I know there's a few pastors that are watching and religious leaders, if they want a little bit more guidance, because especially on like the hate speech bill and all the technicalities of what they can say, can't say, can they engage with 4SA and get some kind of training or advice? Is that what you guys do?
So most definitely, apart from, working before government, parliament, and obviously the courts, a massive part of what we do is educating the public, and in particular religious leaders and just people of faith with regard to what their rights are and what the threats are and how they can actually engage. So we are very open to invitations to come speak, or nowadays it's easier also with the online things. We are very much open to doing that. And then indeed, if there's a particular issue, a particular bill that they need to engage on, we often do these kind of webinars. But then in addition to that, we often do pro forma template submissions that people can copy paste, or they can use the parts they like and throw away the parts they don't like. Because it's so important, Jackie, and we'll be speaking about this, I think in that final session as well, not only to say that you don't support something, but why you don't support something. It's not, you actually need to give reasons. Otherwise, government doesn't really take it into account. And that's because a lot of these things are actually legal, technical. So that's where we really come in, and that's what we do, to make it simple, put it in layman's terms, what the problem is, what we think, how the bill should be tweaked in order to protect our rights, so that the people of South Africa can have a voice in the lawmaking processes.
Absolutely, and I must commend you guys, because you've really taken quite complex, complicated issues, and you've tried to make it as easy as possible for Christians to stand up and to have a voice. And on that point, just to remind those of you who maybe didn't listen last week, 4SA is a non-profit organization. They rely on donations to fund the work that they do. Many of the folks who work at the organization, they have full-time jobs and professions, but they give of their time and their expertise for the sake of our freedoms, our future, our generations, our children. So I really want to encourage those of you watching at home to please consider donating and supporting them. You can do monthly donations, you can do bequeathed inheritances.
And Jackie, just to say, literally every donation, big or small, makes a difference. People often think, how can my 50 Rand, a month or whatever makes a difference? Well, if you add all those 50 Rands that people give, so we do so much still with hard copy, not everything's done online. So that can buy a few reams of paper, or it can help us
for the printer,
or it pays, the petrol to get somewhere so that we can do these talks. So please don't think your contribution is too small. Literally every contribution, big or small, can make a massive difference to actually protect all of our religious rights.
Absolutely. I mean, let's be honest. The price of paper and staples is astronomical. So
exactly,
and I don't want to get off topic here, but I was listening to a sermon last night, and the pastor was talking just about the fact that the return of Jesus is so near, and what are we doing to live out the gospel? And it moved me and it challenged me so much, because I'm privileged enough to work in a Christian environment, but that's not enough. What are the Bible says, where your treasure is where your heart, where your treasure is where your heart is. And if we are not parting with our finances for the work of the kingdom in whatever capacity that is, it's not just about a tithe and saying, oh, okay, I gave God my tithe. No, you owe him that. That's the least. But it's more so than that. It's offerings, it's support. So I don't want to.
What we are doing is so critical to our ability and our freedom to share the good news. Because if we don't have the freedom, to share the good news of Jesus with a neighbor, with a colleague, or whatever, because of the laws, then what does it help? Then it would be just so much more difficult, obviously, to do that in the freedom that we have. So what we are doing is critical to actually to spreading the gospel and keeping the doors for the gospel in South Africa open for as long as possible. As wide as possible.
Absolutely.
Rather donate to us than go pay payroll money one day. But what I was going to say is we're also a Section 18A company for if anyone wants to know that which means that they can get tax deduction certificates from us. Nadene can talk more about that if anyone's interested.
All the details are on the website, and I see Michael's also put it there in the chat box.
Yes, so those of you who are keen to get involved, whether you want 4SA to address your ministers, your leadership team, whether you want to catch up on past resources, their website has everything as well as the donation options. So just getting back, because I see the time is running away with us. I mean, that's what happens when you have 3 women on a webinar, as my husband would always joke like that. So, you know, you guys have mentioned the hate speech bill. I've heard PAPUDA. I mean, there's a lot of acronyms flying around here. So just give us a little bit of a debrief on those, on the hate speech bill and PAPUDA and all those things.
Okay, so those are 2 very important bills, Jackie, that have come up this year, obviously. And why they're important particularly is because of this thing that I've said, we're free to believe in our hearts whatever we want to believe it, but the message increasingly is don't say it and don't live it, because increasingly many of our traditional conservative values and views are being seen as bigoted, fundamentalist, and so forth. So specifically focused in on PAPUDA. PAPUDA is the Promotion of Equality and Prevention Against Unfair Discrimination Act. Just in short, it's known as the Equality Act. It's an existing act that serves to promote equality of all people in South Africa. And what this amendment bill wanted to do is really to strengthen the existing act. So to make sure that we have more equality and less unfair discrimination. Now, all of us would agree with that. That sounds like a wonderful thing. The problem, however, is that, as always, the devil's in the detail. And in this process of achieving more equality and less unfair discrimination, this bill is riding roughshod over a whole lot of other fundamental rights, including the right to religious freedom. And it will actually prescribe to religious organizations, you know, a lot of things in terms of how they need to do membership, you know, who needs to serve in their leadership, you know, with a view to achieving this equality, that no one is excluded, no one is unfairly discriminated, even if those people weren't to hold to the same views of the religious organization. Now, the real problem with PAPUDA is that the existing act already is the act that is being used to take people of faith, pastors, individuals, professionals, business people to courts to say that what you are doing is unfairly discriminating against someone maybe of a different faith, or, you know, who doesn't hold to the same views on, say, gender identity or, you know, sexual orientation or whatever as those people. So already that act is being used often against Christians to either silence them from saying things that other people don't like, or forcing them to compromise on their deeply held beliefs. And the problem with the amendment bill is that it will just make it so much easier for activists to use the law once again to force people to buy into their politically correct agenda. And that is why we had to really, or why we ran such a big campaign on PAPUDA. And once again, the community of faith just responded, and public in general responded in a tremendous way. As a result of that, 4SA was able to get a meeting specifically with the Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffrey, to discuss our concerns with PAPUDA. And what was great was that what came out of that meeting is that he said he takes note of the concerns, in particular of the religious community, and they will go and have another look at PAPUDA to see how they can specifically make sure that religious rights remain protected in PAPUDA. Because if those things aren't written into law, you know, the courts ultimately, when they apply, they don't know about the conversations that happened in the background where government said, no, it's not our intention to infringe on religious rights. So those things must actually be written into the legislation, because ultimately that's what the court applies. And so that's why it's so necessary, not only to say you don't agree with something, but how a bill should be tweaked in order to make sure that religious rights are protected. So that's PAPUDA. And then most recently, obviously, we had the hate speech bill. And the danger with that bill was that for the first time in South African law, it would make certain forms of speech, certain forms of offensive speech that other people maybe don't like, don't agree with, or even find offensive, it would make it a crime. Okay, so that means that if you had to say something that somebody else is, no, that really doesn't sit well with me, like, no, Jesus is the only way, or whatever, they could literally go to the police and lay a criminal charge against you. The police would arrive at your house or your workplace to arrest you, probably a bail application or something, and then a criminal trial, you know, that will cost you lots of money to get somebody in to defend you. For the next 3 years, you'll have this legal sword hanging over your head. And if ultimately you found guilty of the crime of hate speech, because that's what the bill says, then in terms of that piece of legislation, you could receive a fine or even imprisonment up to 3 years in jail time. So very, very serious, because it's a massive restriction, a massive limitation on freedom of speech, and then, of course, also freedom of religious speech. And so that's why, again, we ran this campaign to say the public needs to stand up and have their say against this, because if we don't speak up now, this bill will be passed, and then we can't blame anyone else but ourselves if this thing goes through. And so a massive response. Once again, we want to thank everybody, all the religious institutions, all the people as individuals who sent in submissions. I think at the end of the day, there were just short of 103,000 submissions just on the Dear SA platform. In addition to that, people also sent in submissions directly to Parliament. So massive effort. And as a result of that, we hope that Parliament will now look at it and see how can they build in even further protections for religious speech. So that is exactly what we want the public to do when a bill comes out, Jackie, yes, to really get the message out, get those submissions in, because that is, as Daniela said, what it means to live in a democracy. And that means, you know, it's ultimately the voice of the people that determine the laws that will govern us. So important to take part.
Absolutely. And that's also why it's so important, you know. I know everyone is so afraid always of being spammed, but when it comes to religious freedom, when it comes to Christian information, and I speak both for 4SA and Joy Magazine, people need to sign up to the databases and the newsletters, because we're not going to spam you with rubbish. We live in a time where we find ourselves on the front lines, and we have to be informed, and we have to know the call to action. So I think that that's absolutely critical, that even those of you watching at home, encourage your friends and family to sign up to the newsletters and the databases. When the petitions go round, forward them on, because it's really critical. And as you said, once precedent is set, it's almost impossible to overturn.
It's done and dusted, yes.
So ladies, I know we're running out of time, and I'm sure that those of you at home will just spare us the grace of a few more minutes over time. We've still got 10 minutes to go, but I know there are a couple of questions and things to address. But I want to just say, you know, you guys have been involved in quite a few high-profile court cases. You've had some great victories. I know that there's also been some tough battles as well. Do you want to maybe just talk about the Panda case and maybe one or two other things you were involved in as a team?
Sure. So turning to the Panda case, that's a case that's currently in front of the Joburg High Court, sitting as an equality court. And what that case is about is a Christian private school who is being sued for unfair discrimination because they wanted a learner at that school whose parents voluntarily, subscribed to that school's religious policy to remove other religious clothing from him, because they said, actually, this is a Christian private school. You agreed to our code of conduct, belief, and so forth. Please remove other clothing that has religious connotations. So they've been taken to court for unfair discrimination. Now, 4SA has been admitted as a friend of the court in that matter, and that matter is still to be heard. But this matter will have massive implications for other private religious schools. Because again, we're dealing with a private school different to a public school. And if the court can say to a private religious school whose whole reason for existence is to be able to, live out a specific religious ethos, instill specific religious beliefs in the learners when they attend school there, that actually, no, you need to change what the majority does and believes, to accommodate the minority, that would look, that would have immediate ramifications for every other public school, private school. So, for example, if you had, a Muslim private school and a Jewish learner shows up and says, actually, I want to be able to wear my Jewish clothing or have Jewish prayer time and stuff like that,
They may have to accommodate it.
You see, and that's the thing is, Christians, let's be honest, are often soft targets because we are accepting, we certainly try
we so don't want to offend.
and we try to live at peace with people and to handle things with diplomacy. I mean, we don't go around threatening to blow up a place if we don't agree with them. So, by and large, I do think Christianity becomes an easy target. But to that point, Daniela, I mean, surely if it's a private organization or private entity and there's a code of conduct that parents sign and children sign, surely that cannot be overturned on something like religious garments or what we would consider a minor issue. I mean, how can the law actually even have a case to stand on in that instance?
Let me maybe jump in there because it actually ties in with something that I wanted to mention, Jackie. So what we're getting obviously is continuously there's a clashing of rights. So in this instance, it would be the school's rights to, even as an organization, hold to certain values and beliefs. That's the very reason, like-minded people coming together for certain objectives, in this instance to have Christian education, where the children really, where the entire schooling is immersed in Christian values. But then you get this little boy come in, Zulu boy, with the isipandla, which is the wristband that signifies the, the connection with the ancestors. And they're saying, yes, but we are Christians, but we also have our Zulu culture. And so culture is also a fundamental human right that is protected in the Constitution. So now you have this clash of two fundamental rights. And our Constitution doesn't have a hierarchy of rights. In other words, it doesn't say that where these two particular rights clashes, then this one needs to rank higher or this one carries more weight. So what happens in every instance is that the court then has to weigh up these rights against one another. Think of the scales of justice. They place the one right in the one scale and the other one, and then they see in that particular situation which right should carry greater weight. So that's where the problem comes in, because yes, absolutely, up and until now, courts have very much protected the autonomy of organizations, whether it's the vegetarian club or whatever, much like anyone's welcome to join the vegetarian club, but when you come to this club, you eat your steak at home. We only eat vegetables when we get together. And so the same with private religious schools. Anyone's welcome, but when you sign up to that school, you know that they hold to particular religious values and ethos, and you agree to that. Then you can't come later and complain if now all of a sudden it doesn't suit you any longer. But the problem with this case is that we've never had this clash of culture and religion. And as we know, in South Africa, culture is a very important thing. So that is why this case is so precedent setting, because it could literally overturn years and years of jurisprudence saying that the autonomy of independent private schools should be upheld. And if this case goes the wrong way, then it means that the majority, the 99%, will have to accommodate the 1%. And we can just all think of the ramifications for that in different contexts. So that is why it's actually such a critical case for people and independent schools of all faiths.
Wow. Yeah, sure. It's very sobering to hear these things.
Let me mention this example. There was a recent UK case where there were two street preachers who were actually arrested. And what they were saying, Jackie, and people might be shocked by this, they weren't preaching anything weird, anything that most of us would find offensive or whatever. They were simply declaring, as the Bible says, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And what happened was that they were then, actually a criminal charge was laid against them. And the prosecutor in that case argued that quoting parts of the King James Bible in the context of a modern British society, I quote here, must be considered to be abusive and is a criminal matter. And that there's no longer, and I think the court in that case actually found that there's no place for that kind of rhetoric in a modern Britain. So that's where it's going worldwide, and it's that kind of liberal thinking that is permeating even our own legal system. And we must understand that the activists who are driving this liberal, secular, humanist agenda, they're well orchestrated, well funded, often much more so than the people of faith who have to defend these cases. And it's just there where we find ourselves in the crosshairs.
Yeah, and also, Nadene, sometimes I find a lot of those activists are also more passionate than Christians, because I think sometimes Christians we're so busy fighting ourselves on doctrinal issues that we can't get together on the main critical issues of faith. And that's an indictment against all of us, because
absolutely,
there should be a unity amongst us to stand together, but there should also be an internal motivation to be active in society and not passive. So
and again, coming back to, as I said right in the beginning, that's where Forest A plays a critical role, because we're not a church, we're not a denominational or a religious organization. Our rallying point is the principle of religious freedom. So within our body, we have people who support us, who lie on such different sides of the spectrum with regard to the interpretation of various scriptures, but we rally around this principle of each one should be free to make up their own minds with regard to the scriptures, the holy text, and it's not for the state to tell us how we should believe or how we should live out our beliefs. And around that, as I say, we've really been able to rally various groups of faith, not just from the Christian faith, but even from across the faith spectrum, and even within the Christian faith from different denominations, churches, and so forth. So we really do need to unite around that principle for the freedom of us all.
Absolutely, because I think one very common fallacy is people think that Christians want the state to have a Christian religion and to enforce Christian stuff in every layer of society. That's not what Christians actually stand for. What they stand for is freedom of religion and freedom.
And it's certainly not what Forest A stands for. I want to make that very clear.
Exactly. So, I think people draw a very incorrect parallel there. But when we stand for freedom for everybody, it brings freedom for ourselves too. So just to close off tonight, I'll get into some very specific details in a second, but just broadly speaking, one can listen to what you ladies have said tonight and maybe leave this webinar thinking, well, what's the point? Is there any way to turn the tide? Can me as my little person sitting in my house on my couch actually make a difference? What sort of word of encouragement or charge would you leave us to say, don't lose hope or keep going or something like that?
Yeah. So, Jackie, I want to say two things. Number one, Michael always uses the example of Paul in the Bible. And we see that Paul was a Roman citizen, and he actually used his rights as a Roman citizen a number of times, I think 3 or 4 times. We see examples of where he stood on his rights as a Roman citizen, really in order to keep the doors for the gospel open so that he might have an opportunity to preach Christ. And so in the same way, in South Africa, we've been given democratic rights as citizens, and one of those rights are to participate in the lawmaking processes, not to just surrender and hand it over to government and kind of que sera, no, but to actually have a say in those rules, those policies, those laws that will ultimately govern us. And so we absolutely have not only the freedom but the responsibility to engage when the opportunity is given us. Otherwise, as I say, we have no one else but ourselves to blame if ultimately our freedom to freely share our faith, our freedom to be a witness to Christ by living out our faith is taken away from us, but not only from us, but from our children for generations to come, And so someone once said, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And indeed, because these, as I said before, once these freedoms are lost, they are not easily regained. So that's number one. Number two, I want to leave you with this encouragement, good example. On the hate speech bill, the previous round, I think there was, so before it went to Parliament, when it was still at the Department of Justice, there were 80,000, I think, submissions that came in, and the vast majority of that came from the religious community, and was as a result of that major pushback that we were able to convince the Department of Justice to write in a religious exemption clause in the first place. And yes, that clause needs to be strengthened in the bill, and that's why there was this major pushback again of 103,000 submissions. But it's as a result of that pushback that we are able to go to government and say, this is the number of people that we represent. This is the number of people who are not happy with what is in the bill, that wants it to be tweaked this way or that way to protect their religious rights. For the same reason, it was only because of the major pushback that we were able to, on the Panda Amendment bill, get a meeting with of Justice and say to him, you guys made a big boo-boo when you drafted this bill and you didn't actually protect religious rights, because this will be the effect of the bill as it currently stands. So we one organization, but if 80,000, if 103,000 people of faith, make their voices heard and stand behind us, our voice is much louder. And we can then get the meetings, with the people, with the powers that be, to say, this is what the people of South Africa are saying. And ultimately, we need to understand that numbers do matter. At the end of the day, this is political, and, the numbers speak at the voting box. So it's very important for South Africans to make